Welcome to True Crime Threads. A deadly obsession unfolds in today's chilling story. In a small American town, the quiet and structured life of Alice Miller took an unexpected turn the day she met Amir Rahman. Alice, a woman in her early 40s, had always been known for her practical demeanor and somewhat restrained lifestyle. After a difficult divorce, she found herself craving change, a shift from the daily routine and the predictable paths she had always taken. It was this craving that led her to attend a local cultural festival one weekend, where she hoped to find some excitement and maybe meet new people. What Alice hadn't expected was to encounter Amir, a young immigrant from South Asia who had only recently moved to the area. Amir stood out at the festival with his quiet intensity and thoughtful expressions, watching everything with a sense of wonder yet maintaining a reserved presence. He was still trying to navigate his new world, struggling to balance his dreams of success with the cultural and financial challenges he faced in America. Having left behind his family, he felt both liberated and lost, hoping to find a sense of belonging. His initial impression of Alice was one of curiosity. She seemed confident, independent, and unburdened by the struggles he carried. To him, she symbolized a life he longed for, a kind of freedom he hadn't yet grasped. The conversation between Alice and Amir started innocently enough, with Alice asking him about his life and what had brought him so far from home. Amir, initially hesitant, found himself sharing more with her than he intended about his dreams, his ambitions, and the challenges he was facing as an immigrant trying to make a life in a foreign land. Alice listened intently, fascinated by his story and the contrast between their lives. They came from worlds so different, yet in that moment, they found a surprising connection rooted in their mutual search for change and fulfillment. In the following weeks, Alice and Amir began to meet more frequently. They explored the town together, went on long drives, and found a sense of comfort in each other's company. To Alice, Amir was a breath of fresh air, someone who lived life with a depth and earnestness she hadn't seen in years. She enjoyed his curiosity and the way he saw the world. For Amir, Alice became a beacon of stability and freedom, someone he could rely on as he struggled to find his place in an unfamiliar society. But beneath the surface of this newfound bond, tensions simmered. Friends of Alice raised questions about Amir's intentions and their friendship. They worried she was becoming too attached, too quickly, to someone they barely knew. Yet Alice brushed off their concerns, believing that her connection with Amir was genuine, perhaps even transformative. She had no idea that her pursuit of adventure and connection would ultimately lead her down a dark and irreversible path. As Alice's relationship with Amir intensified, her friends began to notice changes in her behavior. Alice, who once seemed so level-headed, became distant and elusive, often disappearing for entire weekends without explanation. She spent hours away from her job, her responsibilities, and even her closest friends, all for the sake of being with Amir. She brushed off any questions about her absences, vaguely referring to Amir as just a friend. But her friends were not so easily convinced. They noticed a new tension in her voice, a kind of energy they had never seen before, one that felt as risky as it was alluring. Alice saw Amir as a door to a new life. She admired his resilience, his capacity to keep pushing forward, despite the struggles he faced as an immigrant. To her, Amir represented everything exciting and free-spirited that she yearned for. But Alice was blind to the subtle hints of Amir's troubled past. He had secrets. One especially critical detail he had kept hidden from her. Amir had left behind a wife and young son in his homeland, a family he had vowed to return to one day. This truth weighed heavily on Amir, yet he couldn't bring himself to share it with Alice. He feared losing her, feared her reaction, and he feared that the fragile sense of freedom he felt with her would shatter if she knew the truth. One night, Alice stumbled upon a small, folded photograph tucked into Amir's belongings. In it, he stood with a woman and a young child, smiling into the camera with a look of love and pride. Shocked and confused, Alice's heart sank. She confronted him that night, demanding to know who the people in the photograph were. Amir, cornered and unprepared, offered a half-hearted explanation, insisting that his relationship with his family was complicated. He assured her that his feelings for her were genuine and real, but the betrayal had already taken root in Alice's mind. In that moment, her fascination with Amir took on a darker tone. She couldn't simply walk away, not after everything she had invested emotionally. She was drawn to him but felt betrayed, her emotions now twisted into something bordering on obsession. Instead of ending the relationship, Alice kept this discovery to herself, allowing her anger and disappointment to fester. She made a silent decision to keep Amir close, convinced that she could become the center of his life and that, perhaps, he would one day forget about the family he left behind. Meanwhile, Amir, sensing that their bond was shifting, struggled with guilt and uncertainty. He considered leaving Alice and returning to his family, yet his fear of losing both worlds left him paralyzed. He continued to spend time with her, unaware of how deeply she was affected or how drastically her view of him had changed. Friends continued to express concerns, but Alice dismissed them, wrapping herself in her private world with Amir. The secrets, the lies, and the obsession began to form an invisible web around them both, tightening with every passing day. Alice became determined to keep Amir for herself, ignoring the growing cracks in their relationship. Neither of them realized how close they were to a breaking point, one that would soon push both of their lives to a tragic and irreversible end. Alice's obsession with Amir grew stronger each day, consuming her thoughts and dictating her actions. She became fixated on controlling every aspect of his life, convinced that she was the only person who could truly understand and fulfill him. Her discovery of Amir's family only fueled her desperation. She saw his attachment to them as a threat she needed to eliminate. Rather than confronting the reality of his life, Alice chose to ignore it, creating her own version of Amir, a man who would be entirely devoted to her. This fixation began to cloud her judgment, pushing her into a dark spiral where rational thought gave way to intense possessiveness. As Alice's obsession deepened, so did her need to keep Amir close. She began to monitor his movements, showing up at his apartment unannounced and questioning his every action. Every missed call or unanswered text set off a wave of anxiety, feeding her fear that he might abandon her for his family or another life entirely. In her mind, the solution was simple. Amir needed to cut all ties with his past. Alice saw his family as an obstacle, an anchor holding him back from the life she believed they could have together. She pressured him, subtly at first, urging him to stay in America permanently, to forget the obligations he had left behind. Amir, however, was starting to feel the weight of his deception. He knew that he could not indefinitely keep his family in the dark or ignore his responsibilities to them. Torn between the intense relationship with Alice and the guilt gnawing at him, he found himself increasingly conflicted. Part of him wanted to break free from Alice, to return to his family and try to rebuild what he had left behind. But Alice's grip on him was relentless, making it difficult to find a way out. Every time he considered leaving, she would appear with a new plan or scheme, some vision of a future they could share together, and Amir would feel pulled back, trapped by her intensity. The strain took its toll on both of them. Alice began to isolate herself further from her friends and family, who had long since grown suspicious of her attachment to Amir. She stopped confiding in others, guarding her relationship as though it were a precious secret, one that only she could understand. Meanwhile, Amir started to withdraw, his once warm demeanor becoming distant and cold. He sensed the danger in Alice's escalating behavior but feared the repercussions of trying to distance himself. Leaving her now felt more perilous than staying, and he was caught in a cycle of indecision. Alice's possessiveness reached a breaking point one night when she saw a message on Amir's phone from his sister back home. She felt an immediate surge of anger and jealousy, interpreting the message as a reminder that Amir still had connections to his past. In a rage, she demanded that he block his family, cut off all contact, and commit himself fully to their relationship. Amir, cornered and overwhelmed, resisted, pleading with her to understand his obligations. But Alice couldn't comprehend his divided loyalties in her mind. He should be choosing her, and anything less was a betrayal. Fueled by jealousy, her actions grew more erratic. She followed him, showed up at his workplace unannounced, and sent him obsessive messages, demanding explanations for his every move. Neighbors began to notice her late-night visits and the arguments that spilled into the hallway. Despite her erratic behavior, Amir felt powerless to escape. He knew that Alice's grip on him was tightening, yet he didn't see a safe way out. Each day brought them closer to an inevitable confrontation, one that would finally shatter the delicate illusion of control Alice had so carefully constructed. One evening, during a thunderstorm that mirrored the tension brewing between them, Alice made a startling discovery. Amir had purchased a plane ticket to return to his homeland. The ticket was for the following week, a one-way trip that confirmed her worst fear that he was planning to leave her behind and go back to the family she believed he had forgotten. The news felt like a betrayal beyond repair. After all the sacrifices she had made, all the parts of her life she had given up to be with him, the thought that he would abandon her sent her into a spiral of anger and despair. Determined to confront him, she set out in the pouring rain, ignoring the danger and blinded by rage. When Alice arrived at Amir's apartment, her hair soaked and her clothes clinging to her, she barely waited for him to open the door before storming in. Amir was taken aback by her sudden appearance, startled by the wild look in her eyes. She demanded an explanation, pointing to the plane ticket she had found as evidence of his betrayal. Amir tried to calm her down, explaining that he needed to see his family, that he couldn't ignore them forever, and that he had obligations to fulfill. But Alice was deaf to his reasons, only hearing a confession of disloyalty. In her mind, the choice was simple. Amir was either with her or against her, and she was not willing to let him go so easily. The confrontation quickly escalated as Alice's rage reached a fever pitch. She accused Amir of leading her on, of making her sacrifice everything only to abandon her in the end. Amir, feeling cornered and desperate, tried to reason with her, pleading for understanding. But her anger was too overwhelming, and logic held no place in her mind. In her desperation, she saw only one way to keep Amir from leaving, to make sure he could never go back to his family and never choose anyone else over her. In a fit of rage, Alice grabbed a knife from the kitchen counter, her emotions blinding her to the enormity of her actions. Amir stepped back, trying to defuse the situation, but in a sudden, tragic moment, Alice's pent-up fury erupted. A struggle ensued, each of them grappling for control, but in her wild desperation, Alice struck out, and Amir fell silent, collapsing onto the floor. The room filled with a dreadful stillness as Alice stared at what she had done, her mind struggling to grasp the reality of her actions. For a few long moments she stood there, the sound of rain pounding against the windows the only noise breaking the silence. The realization of her actions washed over her slowly, a cold and sickening awareness that she had crossed a line she could never uncross. Panicking, Alice tried to think of a way out, a way to undo what she had done, but there was no escaping the truth. Amir was gone, and her obsession had driven her to an irreversible end. Desperate to avoid the consequences, Alice scrambled to cover her tracks. She attempted to clean up, trying to erase any trace of the struggle that had taken place, but her frantic efforts only left a mess, evidence that she couldn't erase. Her mind raced with scenarios, excuses she could tell the police, a story that might make this seem like an accident. But deep down, she knew that the truth was already out of her control. The neighbors had heard the commotion, and with Amir's body lying there, any attempt to cover up the truth was futile. Alice's attempts to cover her tracks were clumsy and futile. In her panic, she left behind clear signs of the struggle: the overturned furniture, the smeared footprints, the bloodstains she couldn't fully erase. Her frantic efforts were marked by a haze of desperation, but the mess around her seemed to mock her with the evidence of her crime. The storm outside began to ease, and the quiet of the early morning hours made every sound, every movement, feel magnified. She knew she didn't have much time. Neighbors had already heard the argument, some even catching glimpses of her unsteady figure leaving Amir's apartment that night. The next morning, police arrived at the building after receiving calls from concerned neighbors. They discovered Amir's body, his life abruptly cut short, and immediately launched an investigation. Alice, who had spent a sleepless night at home, was contacted soon after. She knew that the moment had come when she would have to face the consequences of her actions. When questioned, she tried to concoct a story, shifting between self-defense and accident, but her inconsistent answers and visible distress made her look increasingly guilty. Detectives noticed how her story faltered, her explanations crumbling under scrutiny, and they began to piece together the real events that had led to Amir's tragic death. As the investigation progressed, Alice's life unraveled further. Friends and family members were interviewed, revealing the changes they had noticed in her behavior since she became involved with Amir. Her friends, who had once been concerned by her obsession, now spoke openly about the erratic actions they had witnessed, the possessiveness, and the disturbing intensity with which she had clung to Amir. Slowly, a picture emerged of a woman whose life had spiraled out of control, driven by an unhealthy fixation that ended in a violent outburst. Detectives uncovered evidence of her threats and possessive messages to Amir, strengthening the case against her and casting doubt on her claims of self-defense. In court, the full extent of Alice's obsession was laid bare. The prosecution painted her as a woman who, consumed by jealousy and a need for control, had taken matters into her own hands when faced with the possibility of losing Amir. The story of how she had pressured him to stay, even trying to isolate him from his family, cast her actions in a dark light. Witnesses described the possessive hold she had on Amir, how she seemed determined to make him hers regardless of the cost. The evidence, combined with her erratic behavior, left little room for sympathy or doubt in the minds of the jury. After a brief but highly publicized trial, Alice was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. The verdict brought a sense of closure to Amir's family, who mourned from across the world, struggling to comprehend the tragedy that had unfolded so far from home. They were left with the bittersweet comfort of justice, though it could never bring back the man they had lost. For the small town, the trial became a haunting story, one that would linger in the collective memory as a cautionary tale about the dangers of obsession and unchecked emotions. Alice's once respected life had transformed into a grim legacy, a reminder of how quickly infatuation could become dangerous when mixed with lies and betrayal. Alone in her prison cell, she was left to face the weight of her actions, the ruin of her life a grim reflection of the dark path she had chosen. The quiet town returned to its usual pace, but people couldn't quite forget the story of Alice and Amir, the tragic adventure that had ended in murder.